Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brian Sanders, and I quit my job and have dedicated my life to the investigation of nutrition and lifelong health. I'm creating the feature-length documentary Food Lies, this podcast, and a health technology company here in Los Angeles with a doctor and two other partners. Today we have Layne Norton, who I had a great time talking with and has a lot of good messages. Nobody should get too caught up in one way of doing something, even if it has tons of apparent benefits. I've always tried to keep an open mind and have repeatedly talked about how many different dietary strategies can work, especially on the two opposite sides of the spectrum. This wasn't supposed to be a debate. Previous guest Dr. Dom D'Agostino recently had a quote debate with Layne on Joe Rogan's podcast, which I recommend that everyone check out. I don't think Dom challenged him enough, so I wanted to have him on and ask a few more questions. I believe people can do fine running on fat or glucose, or both. There's just benefits and downsides depending on which. I see almost no downsides to fat. It's working for me. I see way more lines of evidence pointing to this being our default state, and so I continue to lean on this side as the preferred metabolic state. We talked about a very interesting study that just came out in November that I feel puts a big hit on its position that if you keep protein and overall calories consistent between two groups of people, the fat and carb content doesn't matter. This study, which I linked to in the show notes by Dr. David Ludwig, controls for these, lasts 20 weeks, so long enough to actually get the subjects fat adapted, which I wanted to make a bigger point of that almost all other big studies fail to do, and clearly shows as you drop your carb intake and replace it with fat, you burn more calories. If you're burning more energy, you're losing weight. I have so many regrets on things I could have brought up, and I'm sure I left things out. Many people listening will probably be yelling at their phones that I could have contradicted the old Kevin Hall studies in this way or brought up some points here or there. I'll just say it's hard to get everything out in the moment live on air. One thing I was going to say was NUC funding the study doesn't make it biased. They purposely found researchers that don't agree with the hypotheses to run the experiments with Dr. Ludwig. The subject changed and I forgot to bring this up. I also wanted to point to the blood markers that improved in the low carb group in this study compared to the higher carb group. This is important no matter what, but even more important to me because they weren't in a calorie deficit. They were just maintaining weight. That's huge. Layne always says all the benefits of low carb can be attributed to being in a deficit. He said he didn't get a chance to go over the study yet though. I'll have to ask him about this another time. I posted the images of the graphs from this study on Instagram, so you can see them there if you go back a few posts. Just search for @food.lies. Also, I'm not diminishing all the great aspects of keto. I feel like I'm going to piss off the keto community in this episode because I think I'm dismissing it or not bringing up all the studies showing the unique benefits. That's for another time. I'm talking to Dr. Ryan Lowry about coming on the podcast soon, who is the guy Layne is having a little online war with that comes up in this episode. He'll talk about all the great studies on the benefits of a ketogenic diet. I wanted to focus on other things with Layne. We agree on a bunch of stuff in the first half and then start to debate things in the second half. A bit more about him. He has a PhD in Nutritional Science and background in biochemistry. He's a professional natural bodybuilder. He's won a bunch of competitions. He's published a number of scientific papers. He's a bodybuilding and physique coach and also an author of a new book on weight loss. Before we get to the interview, I want to say if you have gotten any value out of the last 24 podcasts, the best way to show your support is to click through the link in the show notes and pre-order a copy of the Food Lies film on Indiegogo. You can also find it by going to foodlies.org. I'm doing everything I can on a daily basis to spread information and create content to help people find unbiased and accurate information on something that should be everyone's top priority in life, their health. Thanks so much for your support, and here's Layne Norton. All right, well, let's just get going. Thanks, Layne. Thanks for coming on. You know, we talked a while ago and we spent some time trying to line this up, but I'm glad to have you on to talk about all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So someone tipped me off a couple weeks before that Joe Rogan debate you did with Dom. So that was really interesting hearing you guys talk. And, you know, I've been friendly with Dom for a while. But I wanted to talk to you about all this stuff because I think we agree on a lot of things, you know, and I really like your angle of not being a zealot about anything. And I think it's a good angle when you're never really caught with egg on your face, right? If you're not putting all your eggs in one basket and just getting too fired up about a certain way of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a zealot for evidence. So, I mean, I've got my own biases, probably like anybody, but I actually was kind of going back and forth today on Twitter and people were accusing me of being a high carb guy, which I find funny because my research was in protein metabolism, and I was funded by the Dairy and Egg Nutrition Center. So I'm really not a carb guy. I just, when I was on Rogan's podcast, he said it. He's like, you call bullshit. And I do. And it's funny because vegans will accuse me of, being a kind of a meat guy or a protein guy. And then low carb, high fat crowd will accuse me of being a carb guy. And I think, it's kind of this like false dichotomy that because I'm not willing to say that you should just completely omit meat or completely omit carbohydrate, somehow that means that I think you should eat all of them. I said something like, somebody asked me, well, don't you, there's no way you could fit, have a Pop-Tart and have it be part of a healthy diet. I said, okay, well, I think that that's actually not true. I think it depends on context, but there's no foods that are really, unless you get down to like trans fats or hydrogenated oils, we don't really have like kind of dose response curves for those, but there doesn't seem to be like a healthy level of those necessarily. But it's funny that I kind of get pigeonholed into these different positions. And so when I said that, people said, Layne's saying that people should eat Pop-Tarts to lose weight. That's not what I said. I said you can lose weight eating Pop-Tarts. Yeah. Do I think it's the best idea for you to get, a significant amount of your calories from Pop-Tarts? No. But, as a you always kind of can distill things down if you're looking for proof of concept or to debunk anything is, well, let's look at the opposite direction. Okay. So for example, Dr. Mark Haub, there's data out there to show this, but he did like a really cool case study on himself where he get enough protein in, he took protein powders and then literally ate junk food for all of his nutrition intake for, I think it was, I want to say like 3 months. And he lost 27 pounds, improved his cholesterol, improved his insulin sensitivity, and improved all his blood markers. But he was eating 1,800 calories, So people who say, well, calories don't matter. Well, how do you explain this? So it's now, again, if you talk to Mark or Dr. Haub, he would tell you that he didn't think it was the best way of doing things because he was pretty hungry because those foods weren't very satiating and he got kind of tired of them and he would rather had like a big filling salad. But, is it possible? Sure. And I think that kind of the demonization of foods by different groups, it's no wonder people get so confused because if you listen to the vegan crowd, if you have protein's going to kill you. If you listen to the keto crowd, carbs are going to kill you. And if you listen to like even the vegan crowd would tell you that fats are going to kill you too. That it's, like what the health would say that, fats in the bloodstream are what cause diabetes and all this kind of stuff. And the fact of the matter is if you get anything high enough, it causes problems. So I think, I said this on Twitter today, I think people who say calories in, calories out is antiquated or doesn't work, they don't actually understand energy balance. They don't understand what it actually is. And I really feel bad because we're in the age of information. The problem is there's a lot of really bad information out there. And while people are really good at determining, so if you meet somebody and you start talking about a particular topic, you can tell pretty quickly whether they know more than you, less than you, or about the same, right? We're pretty good at figuring that out. What we're really bad at determining is of two people who are more knowledgeable than us, who is the more knowledgeable of the two, right? And this is how things get so confusing for people because they'll hear different experts debate. And while experts may have an idea of who won the debate, people listening probably have no idea. And I can see how these food phobias pop up where people feel like they can't eat anything just from listening to all the experts on TV telling them that everything's going to kill them.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what me and you are trying to do is show that both sides can work and it is so confusing. And that's why I'm trying to make this film is if you can go online and find, or on TV and find equal and opposite arguments for everything, then you just give up or you just don't even know what to do as a normal person.
Yeah, it would be really frustrating, and I actually am I've actually just finished writing a book. We just sent it off for editing, or an ebook called Fat Loss Forever. And my co-writer and I, Peter Baker, we really tried to, I have my own biases, like I said, but we really tried to go into this saying, all right, what actually works for losing weight? And here's the important point, keeping it off for good. And what you find is there's not any one diet that is more associated with weight loss and maintenance than any other diet. whether it's low carb, low fat, any of these diets, there's really almost no association with long-term weight loss. And by long-term, I mean more than losing it and keeping it off for at least 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
What you do find is there are a pattern of behaviors that emerge as being extremely associated with weight loss and maintenance of that weight loss. And I think the reason for this is there's, people, they'll say something like, oh, keto dieting is a hack, like it's a biohack or whatever. That's a very individual thing. So for them, it might have felt like a hack because they said, well, I didn't have any hunger. But the obesity problem is more complicated than just hunger. If it was just hunger, we could all just eat really satiating, low-calorie foods and we wouldn't have a problem. But there's a psychological component to it. There's a sociological component to it. So it's not just that. And so like for me, for example, I talk about flexible dieting where I don't restrict really any foods. I just say whatever fits my protein, carbohydrate, and fat targets. When I started doing that, that felt like a hack, right? Now my restriction is I have to self-monitor. I have to track what I eat, all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't feel like as big of an impingement to my life as being able to enjoy the foods I like, in moderation, of course. That felt like a hack to me. Other people, time-restricted eating feels like a hack, right? They started time-restricting eating and they didn't even have to track calories and they just started consuming less. So what works for one person in terms of enabling them to create a deficit and stay in that deficit is very different from person to person. And that's why I think we need to move towards more individualized approaches for nutrition. And I think the problem becomes, and I think the reason you get people who are so passionate and so zealous about these things is you have somebody loses a lot of weight on, say, a keto diet, and they may have tried a lot of other diets, and all of a sudden the keto diet works for them, right? Like they don't feel hungry. It feels sustainable for them. They don't have to track. Maybe they hate tracking. Like that's a form of restriction they can't stand. And it just works for them. And they misinterpret that as it's somehow magic or that calories don't matter or that this should work for everybody, but it doesn't. And I think most strategies out there aren't going to work for the majority of people. I think it's very individualized. It depends on the person. I think if we approach things more from that facet of, and this is what the book does, we don't say, hey, here's what you should do. We say, hey, here are these options and you should try them out and see what kind of works for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's very important that everyone has to have some sort of mindfulness or restriction or something to lose weight or maintain health, or you're just going to be eating McDonald's and milkshakes all day. There's got to be something. So you're saying have people find what that is for them that's the least restrictive and that's easiest for them to stick to.
That's exactly right. So actually, if I had to pick the top 3 things that emerged in the research of what was associated with long-term weight loss maintenance, number 1 is self-monitoring and cognitive restraint. So meaning people who lose weight and keep it off tend to weigh themselves every day or frequently because that is instantaneous feedback. If they're screwing up on their diet, they're going to see it reflected on the scale and they're more likely to modify what they're doing in response. And then cognitive restraint, that just means whether you're calorie tracking, eliminating carbs, eliminating fats, doing any number of things, time-restricted eating, that's a form of cognitive restraint. IIFYM or flexible dieting is a form of cognitive restraint. Any of those forms, those are important. Exercise, extremely important. From the perspective of exercise doesn't really contribute a huge amount of calories burned throughout the day unless you're somebody who's doing a ton of exercise. But it does 2 major things. 1, it lowers the set point that your body defends. So have you heard of body fat set point theory?
Yeah, sure. Talk about it though.
Basically, the idea is that you have a native body fat that it's more of a range of body fat that your body likes to settle in. And that to get above or below that, you really have to override some signals. So for example, everybody's probably noticed when the first time they ever tried dieting, weight loss was probably pretty easy to a point. And then it really slowed down. That is your leptin going down, your insulin levels going down, and that's lowering your energy expenditure. I'm simplifying it drastically. And your hunger starts to go up. So that is trying to push you back towards your set point where your body feels comfortable. Exercise actually lowers that set point. So instead of, I'm just throwing out arbitrary numbers, but if you were somebody who had settled into like an 18% body fat, 16 to 18% body fat range, if you suddenly put exercise in there, it might lower that to, 14 to 16%. Now that's what you're defending.
Yeah.
And further, the other thing that's very interesting is there's a lot of information showing that exercise actually, or just activity in general, sensitizes you to satiety signals and the inputs from and to the brain. So there was a study done in 1957, where they looked at Bengali workers, and they stratified them into lightly active, moderately active, very active, so like heavy labor, and then inactive. And what they found was like a J-shaped curve. So the individuals from lightly active to very active almost completely matched their energy intake to their expenditure. So they were able to maintain their weight just fine. The people in the sedentary group actually ate more than the lightly active group and almost as much as the moderately active group. Mm-hmm. So it looks like one of the major benefits to exercise in terms of weight loss is not the actual calories you burn, but the fact that it sensitizes you to satiety signals. And in fact, there was a study done, and this is they did it in rats, but they found that just very, very modest amount of exercise significantly decreased energy intake in obese rats after they had lost weight. So what they found was matching an energy gap. So they had one group, both groups have lost weight. One group, they had them do a small amount of exercise a day. The other group did none. But they also ate less. So they tried to match the predicted energy gap, right? So one group was kind of eat less, move less. The other group was eat more, move more. And they found that the group that was eat more, move more actually had better results in terms of keeping off body fat. It was very interesting.
Yeah. Also, I just finally read Hungry Brain by Stephen Guyenet.
Oh, he's fabulous.
Yeah, it's great. Love all of that. And yeah, I'd recommend it to anyone talking a lot about this type of stuff and defending, your set point.
And he's another guy that if you're looking for, sorry to cut you off, Brian, but Stephen Guyenet, if you're looking for somebody who is not married to any one kind of dogmatic, he is extremely good and is very forthcoming about the limitations of different research. And he kind of avoids the whole, this is the, end all be all and whatnot. He's I think one of the top nutrition people. I would love to see him speak in person, actually.
I agree. I've caught some podcasts with him and really like what he's doing, but almost to a fault though. He's almost too we just should eat foods that don't taste good so we don't activate our reward signals and just eat in moderation. It's almost like let's give up and just do really simple things. But I guess in a way that's a good thing.
It's tough because if you look at the research data, it starts to get really depressing, because what it basically says is if you don't want to be obese, just never get there because you're not getting out of it. That's kind of what it says. I don't think that that's the truth. It's just, like I said, about 95% of people fail at getting out of it. And part of the reason is if you look at the behaviors that are required for weight loss and then maintenance of that weight loss, it's more of a mentality than it is just, there are some things that are very hard to train into people. Like for example, the third major thing that I was going to mention was they're very highly associated. This is extremely highly associated with weight loss and maintenance of that weight loss, is having what we call low recency. Recency is a characteristic where you value present information much more than future information. So people with low recency value future information. It's not the same thing as delayed gratification, but for the purposes of weight loss, you can basically think of it as the same, right? So people who can delay gratification are much, much, much more likely to be able to lose weight and keep it off than people who, everybody knows someone who just gets stuck in the yo-yo diet cycle of, I've just got to lose 10 pounds as fast as I can. And those people typically, they don't take on lifestyle modifications that are sustainable, and they end up just putting it all back on.
Well, yeah, in the now, the delicious food is too tempting for them. And Guyenet has talked about that in the book, is that they don't think of their future self. It's a little bit of like Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and thinking slow, the immediate versus the future self.
Yeah, I use financial examples a lot just because I find it to be more intuitive for a lot of people. So there was a study done, I think they took, this is years ago, but it's like a classic psychology study. I may butcher it a little bit, but I think what they did was they took young kids, I want to say like 5 to 8 years old. They sat them in a room and they put a single marshmallow in front of them. And they said, if you don't eat this, right now, you will get another one. But they didn't tell them how long they had to wait. They just said, if you don't eat this now, well, you will get another one. 100% absolutely get another one, but you have to wait. The kids...
Or you get two later.
The kids who waited had an extremely high association with better success outcomes, income, all those sorts of things later in life. And there's also, it also may explain why people who tend to be in the upper... There's multiple explanations for this, but it may be one possible explanation why people who have more money, people who are wealthier, tend to have lower rates of obesity. Now, you could look at that and say, well, they have more access to fresh foods and gyms and exercise and whatnot, and that's probably part of it. But it's probably also that they have become successful because they have low recency, because they can look into the future, because they have patience and value what they can visualize what they could be if they do the work, right? And that's really hard for a lot of people. And that's something that's really difficult to teach. I think you can kind of train it into people, but it takes, I would say I have a lot of willpower. So if I just decide I'm going to stop doing something, I stop doing it like that day. I don't wait till Monday. I don't wait till the first of the month. I just stop. Or if I decide I need to start doing something, I don't wait till next week. I do it now. And then I usually don't have a problem going back on those behaviors. So, but I wasn't always like that. When I was 15 years old, if you were trying to get me to stick to a diet, it would be very difficult, but you could, right now, if I decided to diet down, you can have all the junk food you wanted in the house and it wouldn't bother me. I just wouldn't eat it. Yeah. Because I know that if I eat it and go over my calorie allotment, I'm not going to hit my goal.
Yeah. So how did you get to that? And then I know you do coaching and stuff. Yeah. So how do you get people on that path?
Yeah. So the first thing is starting with little victories, right? So just telling them just try getting in the gym 3 times a week, right? And building up some confidence. But the problem is it's very, very slow. And my turnover for clients, I would say I have more success with clients than most people, but I don't have a high rate of success because nobody has a high rate of success because the success rate for lifestyle modification is very low. Anybody who says they have a high rate of success with clients for long term is lying. So you have to start slow, and it really takes years of this kind of training. If you're taking somebody who's, high recency and they're kind of a short-sighted person, to get them to understand the benefits to this long-term thing, right? It's why are most people I think they said something like 70% of Americans couldn't write a check for $5,000 if they had to. 70% of Americans above age 25, I think is the statistic, could not write a check for $5,000 if they had to, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, right? So, but why is that the case? There's plenty of people who make a lot of money who are also broke, right? Yeah. So it's behavior. And much like financial stuff, nutrition can be very similar where it takes time to build up those behaviors. For example, I'm a pretty frugal person as well. So I don't have a problem saying no to something. And in fact, when I say no to spending money, I actually feel good. If I say no to, or if I restrict myself and I hit my goal nutritionally, that feels good. I don't feel like, man, I regret so much not having that piece of cheesecake. I've never actually had that thought,
It's changing your reward structure. And I did this to myself. I really agree with this. Is before my rewards, in college, would be, drinking beer, or playing video games or whatever. And then I changed that to being healthy, or you're rewarded. Yeah, you don't feel like you're restricted by not going and getting on a vacation or getting a fancy car because that's not your reward structure anymore.
Right, exactly. So you have to kind of flip that to whatever your goal is and, making that the primary focus of everything. But it's just hard to do that. There's just not, with anything, not just weight loss. It's just that I think part of it is that we live in a really sedentary society, and that has you combine that with a very obesogenic environment, meaning free access to cheap, high calorie foods, and you have a recipe for obesity, right?
Yeah.
People want to make it out to be about carbs or make it about fats, and I think it's just a waste of time, to be honest. Just to give you an example, if it was just carbs, I don't think I've ever heard an obese person say, God, I just can't stop eating bananas. If I could just stop eating bananas, I wouldn't be fat anymore. I just can't stop eating apples. Like, you just don't really hear that, you know? Now, I'm sure there are some people out there who overeat on fruit, but they're very minimal. You know, when people say like they're sugar addicted or that sort of thing, they're really talking about stuff that's high in sugar and fat. You know, like you're talking about,
Absolutely.
that's what the very, very palatable food is. You could argue like things like Skittles and gummy worms and that sort of stuff. And sodas, obviously, because they don't have a lot of satiating effect. But for the most part, when people are talking about foods that are quote unquote addictive, they're talking about like chips and like cakes, candies, pastries, things that are super palatable. Well, those are things that are high in sugar and fat. When you combine sugar and fat, that's when stuff gets really palatable. Like, try to overeat on just a plain baked potato. Good luck. You know, if you've ever had like just a straight up plain baked potato, try to get through a few of those a day.
There's a 1995 Holt study that showed that was the most satiating thing.
Yeah, it is.
Food that exists.
It's very satiating.
And and I think that's a unifying theme of everyone that I trust and think is smart, is just don't eat fat and carbs together. That's what we should all be talking about, and not worry about the two different sides. I hate people taking one strong side, like a vegan side, because they never acknowledge that the other side works.
Right.
When if you're standing over here, I can see how both sides work. And I know it's not just carbs, because you could look at the Kitavans or Simone, or there's tons of examples of Okinawans that eat tons of carbs and are perfectly healthy.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So that's just a stupid argument over which one. Yeah. Just don't do them together. But I think there are some benefits to eating fat. I want to get into some of that stuff later. Maybe we could talk about that. But why do diets fail? So you saw yo-yo dieting, because
down the rabbit hole.
Every time you diet, it's harder.
Yeah, so there was actually there's multiple reasons they fail. The psychological and sociological reasons we talked about before. Set point theory, where your body's always trying to get you to go back to your kind of original starting point. But also, if you think about how a lot of people diet, which is that yo-yo diet where they'll lose 10 pounds by some kind of really extreme lifestyle modification, and then they bounce back up 10 or 15. And they lose it again, bounce up, lose it again, bounce up. There was a study. It was done in rats, so I don't want to oversell it. But it's hard to do these sorts of studies in humans because, well, one, humans are very genetically diverse. So you get a lot of like data artifacts with humans because their genetics are so different that a lot of times it's really hard to pick out whether or not the treatment you did, the result you saw, if it was because of the treatment or because you just had a really genetically different population, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where it becomes things like animals and rats are great because you can get a strain of rats that are basically genetically identical, right? Mm-hmm. And you can feed them however you want to feed them. You can train them to feed however you want. So people poo-poo animal studies, but they're really useful for helping like tease out some data that we would never be able to get in humans. And there was a study done, I think it was in like 1987, and they looked at like 2 dieting cycles. So they had obese rats lose weight, come back up, lose weight again, and come back up again to their original weight. And what they found was that the second time losing weight, they lost it at half the original rate. So their second time going through to lose, they lost it at half the speed. It took them twice as long to lose the same amount of weight as the first dieting cycle on the same calories, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. And then they regained it. They regained it 3 times as fast on the second time. So what happens, and this is why some people don't understand energy balance and calories in versus calories out, is calories in and calories out are not independent variables. They're both inextricably tied to each other. For example, let's use a financial example again. If you were making $30,000 5 years ago, and now you're making $230,000, do you spend the same amount of money? Probably not. No. You probably spend a lot more, right? Now you may still be saving more than you did years ago, and you probably are, but you'll spend more, right? On the whole. Mm-hmm. Energy balance kind of works like that. If you eat more, you expend more, but you can overeat your expenditure, right? So obese people, when they look at them, people say, oh, I have a slow metabolism. Most obese people have normal or even fast metabolisms. They're just overeating above that. When you diet, your metabolism slows down. What's interesting is those adaptations. So, for example, you have 4 basic components to your metabolic rate. Your basal metabolic rate, which is basically the energy it takes to keep the lights on, right? Just to run your survival processes. That's about 50 to 60% of your total daily energy expenditure. And then you have what's called non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis, or NEAT. And that's very modifiable and can be anywhere from like 5% to 20%, I think, something like that. Then you have thermic effective food, which is like around 5 to 10%. So that's the amount of energy your body has to expend to extract energy from the food you eat. So kind of like a car's internal combustion engine, you got to put energy in to get energy out, but you'll always net more energy than you put in, but you still got to put it in. And then finally, your exercise, your activity expenditure, right? Just what you spend moving around day to day, walking, exercising, that sort of thing. Those are the four basic components of your total daily energy expenditure. 3 of those, your BMR, your NEAT, and your activity, all typically drop when you diet. So BMR, and they drop to a greater extent than you would predict through just physics alone, right? Because if you lose, say, 30 pounds, well, of course your metabolic rate drops because you're carrying around less tissue. You don't need as much. You don't need to expend as much. But they find that on average, it drops by about 15 to 20% more than you would predict from just the weight loss alone.
Yeah, well, evolutionary, your body wants to not lose its fat, right? That's why it's defending its set point.
Yes, and the thing is, every time you diet, we talk about this in the book. We called it the body's self-defense system. Well, we adopted that term from a researcher named Paul MacLean at the University of Denver. Every time you diet, you're triggering that self-defense system. And people who yo-yo, this is my own hypothesis, but people who kind of yo-yo diet, you're kind of constantly triggering that system, right? Like think if you just multiple times a year are telling your body, food is scarce, food is scarce, food is scarce. Of course you're going to lower your metabolic rate. Of course you're going to regain weight faster because what you're telling your body is, hey, food is really scarce. We need to be really efficient with it. And from an evolutionary perspective, so that's the first prong. We call it a 3-prong attack. That's the first prong of your body's self-defense system. The second prong is while you're dieting, while you're losing weight, your body is already upregulating systems that increase your potential for fat storage. Why would it want to do this? Well, if you were in a famine, think about this from an evolutionary perspective. If you were in a famine, when you finally came across a sufficient source of calories or food, you would want to be able to capture as many of those calories and energy as possible and store them, right? Because what your body knows is that food is scarce. And so your body actually gets better at storing energy when you've been in a deficit. So you've probably heard people say, like, after they finish a diet and they're gaining weight back, I just feel like everything sticks to me. I feel like everything sticks to me. Well, that's because it does. So there's that. And there's also this really interesting phenomenon that MacLean observed in one of his studies. For the most part, your fat cell number does not change. It's the size of the fat cells that shrinks or expands. Now, if you become very obese, you can overeat yourself to the point where your body produces more fat cells because we think that the maximum size on a fat cell is about 100 microns. That's about as far across as it'll go before you have to create more. So the interesting thing is that at the end of a diet, transitioning from dieting to overfeeding, if you gain weight at a rapid enough pace, they've actually shown that these, what they call pre-adipocytes, which are small nascent adipocytes that are not fully formed, will start to differentiate into fully formed adipocytes. And they actually showed in a study. So they basically, now again, in rats, so I want to qualify that, but I don't really think you could do this study in humans. They had obese rats lose 1/7 of their body weight, and then they basically, at the end of it, they just gave them free access to food. Basically, have at it, boys, however much you want. And within days, they saw, first off, they regained the weight extremely quickly. Second, they increased their adipocyte number by 50%. That's pretty nuts if you think about it. Now, for people listening out there, you lost fat and you gained 5 pounds back. You didn't increase your adipocyte number, so chill. But what was interesting is those rats started dieting at about 700 grams of total body weight. They got down to 600 and they got back up to 700 and were still overfeeding at that point. And they did not stop gaining weight until they got to 740 grams. What's interesting about that is they did not stop overfeeding until their individual cells were back up to the size that they were before they started dieting. So their set point, right? Their set point size.
Yeah.
But now, since they had more total cells, each individual cell is smaller. So to get them back to the original size, their overall fat mass had to get bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting.
So, from an evolutionary perspective, if you've told your body food is scarce, food is scarce, food is scarce, and then you rapidly regain it, again, I'm going out on a limb here, and this is my own hypothesis as to why this might occur. If you're stuffing fat into adipocytes at a rapid rate, so basically binge eating after you've been dieting, which does happen with a lot of people, those fat cells start to rapidly expand. My guess is the reason this gets triggered, one, you have low thyroid, lower leptin, and lower insulin, all of which actually inhibit pre-adipocyte differentiation. So insulin, which probably seems counterintuitive to people, but leptin and thyroid actually inhibit pre-adipocyte differentiation. Well, those are low from dieting. But if you're putting so much nutrients into fat cells, my guess the reason the body may do this is because it's kind of preparing for the fact that you're going to exceed the capacity for those cells. And it's, for lack of a better term, scared. I'm using air quotations right now, scared that you're not going to be able to capture all that energy. And again, your body's main goal is survival. Survive, keep you alive long enough to pass on your genetic material. So it wants to make sure you can store that energy. And so it triggers this pre-adipocyte differentiation to ensure that you can capture all that energy. So pretty cool stuff. Basically, it's petrifying if you're somebody who's like dieting. But what I tell people is like, when you get to the end of a diet, you better have a plan. This is why I tell people, like, don't diet into vacations. Diet down, get to your goal weight early, and then slowly bring your metabolic rate back up by slowly adding food back in, and then go on your vacation so you can eat a little bit more and not gain weight. But, these people who they diet down so they can look good for their trip to Cabo, and then they're staying in an all-inclusive resort and they gain 15, 20 pounds, which I have seen happen in a week. Is this stuff happening? It's hard to say because we haven't shown those studies in humans, but it would explain a lot of the stuff I see with people kind of overshooting their body fat, because that happens pretty often. Like, I'm sure you've known people who have weight cycled their entire life, who every time they go down and they come up, the up is higher and the down is lower each successive time. And if you look at the research data, it kind of bears that out. So people who lose weight, anywhere from 85 to 95% of them will put it all back on. And of those people who put it back on, 1/3 to 2/3 will add more than they originally had, which is pretty petrifying.
So crash dieting is the worst thing you can do. I think going on juice fast is the worst thing you can do as well, because now you're not getting enough protein either. And then you're just going to be miserable after and eat a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, I think any sort of fad, unsustainable type diet, what I always ask people when they're doing a diet is, can you see yourself doing this 3 years from now? Because if you can't, you've got to come up with something else, because this is going to fail.
Well, we shouldn't even call it a diet. There needs to be a better word for it, because we're talking about you can't go on a diet. It's almost going to inherently go wrong. You need to just change your way of eating.
Yes, it has to be lifestyle modification. You can't view it as a start point and an end point, because if you do, it's going to fail. I mean, it's a great observation that we always hear things like, you got to make it a lifestyle. You got to make it a lifestyle. You got to make it a lifestyle. A lot of times associated with things that are very hard to make a lifestyle, right? Like, I see this on like alkaline diet stuff, which is complete hogwash. Yeah. But like the way they're telling you to eat, very few people could ever sustain that, So you can't just tell somebody make it a lifestyle if it's not something that's very sustainable. One of the reasons I like flexible dieting is I've found for some people, that's a very sustainable way of eating, but you've got to pick your restriction, and whatever. I think the form of restriction that requires the least amount of willpower is probably going to be the most effective. And here's why. For me, that's tracking my food, because it doesn't bother me tracking my food. It takes 5-10 minutes out of my day now because I'm so experienced with it. So it doesn't bother me. I prefer that type of restriction to others. But if you're not going to track your food, then you're going to have to do another form of restriction, whether it's keto where you cut out carbs, or time-restricted eating, or something of that nature, right? Because if you're not going to track, you've got to create a restriction some other way. But for some people, they hate tracking. that gives them a lot of anxiety, especially for people who have like OCD tendencies. Like if they can't get their numbers to fit perfectly, they get freaked out. Sometimes time restricted eating may feel like less willpower is required. So the reason it's important to pick something that requires the minimum amount of willpower is people don't usually fail diets when everything's going perfect in their life. Like when they're in their environment, they're in a routine, they've got structure, that's not when they fail. They fail when they're going through a divorce, or they have stress at their job, or they've had a really stressful day and they come home and they don't have time to cook fresh food and feel like they don't have time, and they just reach the cabinet for whatever they got. That's when people fail diets. So that's why it needs to be something that requires the minimum amount of willpower, because it's not like, from what we know scientifically about willpower, there doesn't seem to be different buckets for willpower. So it's not like you have willpower for your job, willpower for your spouse, willpower for your kids, willpower for your diet, willpower for your exercise. It all comes from the same spot. So when do we start having trouble sticking to stuff? It's when a lot of those things are malfunctioning at once, right? So hopefully we pick something that requires the minimal amount of willpower. So even when life's really crappy, we can still stick to it. So that's why, I understand what Joe Rogan was saying by saying, well, people just don't have discipline. I think it's definitely part of that. That's definitely true.
Yeah, some are more than others. Yeah.
Right. But I think also telling somebody, hey, you just need to be more disciplined, I don't think that's that helpful, because it kind of like creates this. And Joe is a different animal. Joe is a very disciplined person, obviously worked very hard to get where he is. And I hope it doesn't sound like I'm trying to criticize him for that statement, but I think you miss out on how that sounds a little bit elitist, right? For the person who's just trying to start on this. So
like I'm better than everyone because I'm so disciplined.
Right. Discipline is a skill, right? Joe probably didn't start being that disciplined. He may have had more discipline than other people to start, but he probably developed it throughout life. But then some people would argue that, okay, well, he likes to smoke marijuana, which I don't have a problem with. I've used marijuana before. But, some people would say, well, he's undisciplined in that realm. But maybe that's his layer of release or whatever it is. Well, for some people, imagine if that was food. So imagine if that release was food. Some people, it's a couple glasses of wine. Some people smoke marijuana. Some people, they gamble, whatever. Most people have some kind of release that would be considered not perfectly healthy. I think I read somewhere that everybody in the world could probably be diagnosed with some kind of, mental disorder if you dug hard enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So which one is it?
So I think just telling people have more discipline. I think it's good to strive to be more disciplined, but I think just telling somebody that, it's kind of akin to just saying eat less, move more. It's like, okay, well, thanks.
Yeah, that's stupid. And I work with a doctor and I do some health coaching, and you need to investigate the person and find out what's the easiest, the most minimal effort for them to stick to, and then go down that route. But that's think, right. Yeah. You mentioned all different ways to do it and then just base it on their individual needs. But I still think that there is a better way to do it, though. I'm not a ketosis guy. I've never measured my ketones. I've never cared about being in ketosis. It's not my thing at all. Maybe I'm accidentally in ketosis, but I think there's benefits to being fat adapted. So maybe we could talk about that for a second. Actually, I saw recently you're in some war with Dr. Ryan Lowry, some keto doctor guy. Well, first, what's going on there? Because I want to get into some of this stuff.
Well, full disclosure, there's some personal stuff between myself and his PhD advisor. It's a long story that I can't really talk about much. Or sorry, it wasn't his PhD advisor. It was his master's advisor, Jake Wilson. But they published some data that I had some real problems with. Let me just put it this way. There was a history of their lab producing extremely favorable results for whatever they were measuring. And I was actually on a paper with a lot of other scientists who criticized. I'm just giving background so people can know why I was so, one of the reasons I was so critical of Lowry, because his statements towards me really weren't, there have been other people who have gone after me a lot more. I was just very annoyed that he decided to go after me. So they did an HMB study, they did HMB plus supplemental ATP, which, by the way, ATP in all the research out there. So we're talking about adenosine triphosphate, your energy currency of the cell. It doesn't survive digestion. It just doesn't. Those are high energy phosphate bonds. They're going to be broken apart during digestion. Anyway, they showed that HMB plus ATP in trained people was basically better than steroids. The results they saw if you compare them to studies using steroids, we're better. I don't believe that. I'm sorry, I just don't believe that. Especially when every other study on HMB we have shows like really, really modest benefits, if benefits at all. So there was that. And then they also did a keto study that was very criticized where they looked at keto versus non-keto and like effects on lean body mass and fat loss and all this kind of stuff. And they had basically, if you tease apart the data from week 1 to week 10, there's no differences between groups. And then from week 10 to week 11, suddenly there's this massive increase of like 3 kilos of lean body mass in the keto group. So it's like, okay, well, where did that come from? It's just, I have some real problems with the data they publish. And Ryan basically criticized some of the things I said in the Joe Rogan podcast. He actually brought up a couple studies on fructose I hadn't seen. So kudos to him for that. The one study, I guess he was making the point that all calories aren't kind of the same thing, which I've never really said that the source of calories doesn't matter. So that's kind of a straw man argument. But he showed a study looking at people fed 25% fructose versus 25% glucose, additional like drink per day, 25% of their calories from it, and showed that these the people who were getting fructose had like weird things going on with insulin sensitivity and blood lipids and whatnot. Well, I could buy that. But 25% fructose, getting 25% of your calories from fructose, that's really difficult because even sodas are only 55% fructose. So you're talking about, like, first off, you have to be getting at least 50% of your calories from carbohydrate, right? And then of those,
which
you have
many
to be
people
eating,
do.
Sure, I would agree with that. But then you have to be getting at least half of that from fructose, which even fruit itself is at most about half fructose. So I question how physiological it is.
Well,
but I mean, maybe. So there was a fair point there. But he brought up a study. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Well, I think it is definitely possible. But I mean, just talk about fructose itself. It seems to be harmful, uniquely harmful. Do you not think so?
Actually, if you look at like lower levels of fructose, it seems to actually be maybe better than glucose, to be honest, because it doesn't impact blood sugar levels. It doesn't.
It's your liver. Yeah, it needs to be. Yeah, it doesn't, but it needs to be processed by your liver, and yeah, that's where the problems occurs. People, fatty liver.
Sure, but it only occurs at high levels. So I think the problem with a lot of the thinking in nutrition is they'll look at something like that and they'll say, well, if a high level is really bad, then we shouldn't have any of it whatsoever. And that's not true.
Well, yeah, there's like a U-shaped curve to everything, basically.
Not necessarily everything, but yes, a lot of things.
A lot of things.
So for fructose, it seems that way as well, that there's like a lower or modest amount of fructose actually seems to be good for satiety. And if you just look at the data on fruit. People who eat fruit tend to be, associatively wise, healthier. So if fructose was really, dose dependently bad, we would see people who eat a lot of fruit be pretty unhealthy, but that's not what we really see. So I think the point there is that anything is probably bad if you get it too high. Because even if glucose isn't great if you get it too high. Fats aren't great if you get them too high in the context of overall calories. So kudos to him for bringing that up because I hadn't seen that study. But he, in an effort to kind of really entrench his ketogenic bias, he cited a study from 1971 because I had said on the Joe Rogan podcast that if you equate calories and protein, that carbs and fats don't seem to make a difference on fat loss. And that's very true if you look at the studies. There was a meta-analysis of 32 studies where they equated these two things and saw, if anything, the fat restriction favored a little bit more fat loss. I don't think it was meaningful, but if anything, it tended to be a little bit better for fat restriction. But he cited this study from 1971. He said, these were protein and calorie equated, and they saw differences in fat loss. That the groups eating the lowest amount of carbs lost the most amount of weight. I don't think he actually read the study. So I went and I pulled up the study. I paid $50 for it because it wasn't available open access for me. And that was the worst $50 I've ever spent in my life. So in the study, they didn't report any statistics, and there was a whopping 2 to 3 people per group.
Yeah, no, I saw that it's only like 8 people total, but
8 people total in the entire study. Yeah,
I agree with that. Yeah, that's not a great study, and I actually just saw a video he did in response to that, and he pulled out that meta-analysis of 32 studies and looked at all of them And a ton of them only had around 8 people in them showing the benefits of.
Right, but he's being a little bit disingenuous in that because the purpose of a meta-analysis is to pool data. So yes, while individual studies may have only had 8 people or 10 people or lower amounts, the reason you do a meta-analysis is because what a meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. And you have certain inclusion criteria, right? So the inclusion criteria for this meta-analysis basically was they had to be protein and calorie equated, and I think there were some other parameters. And if the study did not fit those, they were excluded. So basically they're comparing they're taking all these separate studies and they're pooling them together to strengthen the power of these studies. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and then they run statistical analysis on these. So yes, there were probably some studies in there that were underpowered, but when you pool them together, you see that's where the real benefit of a meta-analysis is. So he's kind of creating I don't want to say a straw man. That's a wrong, the wrong logical fallacy, but it's kind of missing the forest through the trees.
Well, okay. Well, we'll leave that aside. But there's a big study yesterday that came out and hit the news.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're saying, I was tending to agree with you though before, where you're saying if you equate for calories and equate for protein, that it doesn't really matter fat or carbs. And I was been on board with kind of that since day one. I mean, my first podcast, I had some bivalve vegans on, and they eat all carbs, fruit and vegetables, low fat, and some oysters. I was like, that's fine, right? So yeah, and I'm not debating the energy equation too. Just to recap, the energy equation stands no matter what, right? You laid it out well, that what's happening is you're spending more energy on that energy side if you're taking in less. So you're never breaking the laws of physics. So calories do matter. The separate discussion is what is the quality of your calories, right? Which is a totally different discussion than some people confuse, maybe layman keto people think that calories don't matter or that calorie balance doesn't mean anything. Of course it means something. There's more going on. But so this study yesterday, protein, calories equated, it was done by Nusi, Gary Taubes' thing, and Ludwig. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was pretty good. So do you have problems with how it's conducted? Because it showed that there was more energy burned when you're burning fat.
Aha, yes. Did they show more fat loss?
Well, they equated for fat loss. That was the point of it. They controlled calories and they adjusted it to make sure that there was no fat loss.
Okay. The problem with that is it's a different question. So if you're saying, so they're basically keeping them at maintenance. So if
they had a pre-run, sorry, just to lay it out for people who didn't read it, they had a pre-run where they dropped body weight about 10%. And so they lowered their weight and then they kept them at maintenance for 20 weeks.
Yeah, I have this study somewhere. Hang on one second. Oh, there's a very similar study that they ran in 2012 because I'm looking at it. I have it right here on my desk. Yes, they've shown this previously that they increase energy expenditure. And maybe I would like to see other non-Nusi sources replicate this. But I mean, even Kevin Hall showed that a ketogenic diet had a little bit more energy expenditure. But Hall has already commented on this paper. And you have to remember that we are trusting the instruments that measure this stuff to measure it accurately. And I don't want to poo-poo the measurements. However,
doubly labeled water.
Right. So, but it's still there are errors in any measurement because I've been involved in those studies. Now, again, that equate
for this. I read they mentioned that in the end of the paper.
I think
it only account for a tiny error and nowhere near the large and distinct differences in each group that they found.
Where I'm not attempting to discredit the methods of measurement, but with any measurement, there's a certain source of error, and you can have data artifacts. Could it be? There was also a study that came out that showed that it's more difficult to overeat on a ketogenic diet versus a non-ketogenic diet. That may be the case. Perhaps, maybe you don't lose more fat in a caloric restriction from a ketogenic diet, but maybe you can eat more calories at maintenance or in a surplus, and you have a greater energy expenditure. That's possible. I'm willing to consider that. But when we talk about actual fat loss, we don't see those. Like Kevin Hall, his study where they had him in a metabolic ward for 4 weeks only showed a difference of metabolic rate of about 50 calories a day. And that didn't produce differences in fat loss. In fact, the fat restricted group actually lost a little bit more fat overall. So we always have to be careful when we're talking about these surrogate measurements, because what is the thing we're trying to show? Are we trying to show that we're increasing energy expenditure, which is useful, or are we trying to show that one leads to more fat loss than the other? Does that make sense?
Energy expenditure will lead to more fat loss.
Possibly, but why haven't we seen that in the other studies then? No, because what this study...
How many other well-controlled studies were there that done?
What this study didn't look at a deficit, though. You're talking about at maintenance or in a surplus, which is a different question. You can't assume. So I'm not discounting the fact that in a maintenance or surplus, that a ketogenic diet could produce greater energy expenditure. What I'm saying is that in our studies where we look at deficits, where we look at fat loss, when you equate calories, you don't see differences in fat loss. But perhaps you can eat more calories in a surplus or maintenance through some mechanism that hasn't been identified yet with a ketogenic diet. I'm willing to consider that.
Okay, this shows that not all like macro ratios affect the body equally.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with that. I've never said that it didn't.
Equating for protein and and so it seems logical that if they redid the study but didn't allow them to maintain weight.
But it doesn't seem logical because they've done those studies before. They've done fat loss studies before with ketogenic versus non-ketogenic, and they haven't seen that. So, I mean, yes, I would love them to do that, but we have those studies already, and they don't see differences in fat loss. So, and if anything, there was a slight, what was the study? I've got all these.
For one, the studies weren't done long enough, like to get keto adapted. And these wasn't even keto, actually. We shouldn't even talk keto. We're just talking about lower carb. This was still 20% carb, which is
this study we're talking about
not
right now?
Keto. Yeah, this one, the lowest group was still 20% carb, which is say 100 grams of carbs up to 150.
Could be keto for some people,
not
but possible.
Well, not really. Mainly keto's under 50 grams of carb.
There's quite a few people that can get into ketosis, especially active if they're about 100 grams of carb.
Yeah.
A day. But if you want to be safe,
these were already people who were overweight, and they were just normal people around a college campus. But most of these studies, they weren't done where they're truly fat adapted, and that's when the benefits come in. When you're doing these metabolic ward studies, they're not long enough to get those benefits, and that's why this one is good. It's 20 weeks.
Actually, they've shown that the real energy expenditure, I can't remember the exact study, so I'm gonna have to. I know I've seen it, but like during the fat adaptation, where people are not fat adapted yet, that's actually where energy expenditure goes up the most. That once they are fat adapted, that it starts to come back down because there's inefficiencies when you're transitioning. When you're in that transition, there's inefficiencies there. It's one of the reasons you feel very tired because energy production is very inefficient. So
most of the benefits it may ramp up quickly, but in all the studies I've seen on the more keto side, they show that once they're fat adapted, all the benefits come in after the third week. Say,
what specific benefits though?
There are many benefits that go beyond what we're talking about.
Right.
That people naturally eat less. Right, they're at a deficit. Yeah. So I'm not saying that they're all like perfectly equated for calories and protein. It's just some of this stuff is because they're eating a deficit without even knowing it.
Of course.
And yes, a lot of the benefits happen. Also, we never really explicitly said, but your big stance is basically all the benefits of any diet happen because you're in a deficit, not because of some magical properties.
Oh, that's correct. Now, again, can the type of diet you're on influence how much energy you expend and the deficit? Oh yeah, like higher protein diets, absolutely. They have a higher thermic effect of food, they increase energy expenditure, and they've been shown to be mostly superior for fat loss and muscle retention.
And more satiating.
Absolutely. In fact, some of their original studies on keto had trouble, couldn't tease apart the benefits because the keto studies were higher in protein versus like they were, I think a lot of Volek's original studies were a little bit higher in protein within the keto group compared to the, like they were kind of comparing the food guide pyramid. But again, I'll be full disclosure, the new paper, since it just came out, I've had everybody messaging me about it. I have not had the chance to really dig into it yet. So I wish I had that chance so far because I would love to be able to speak a little bit more eloquently about it. But again, it's one of those things that I'm not saying that there aren't certain benefits to certain diets. Now, the question becomes again, is that sustainable for the individual, right? Because if it is, great. But if it isn't, and what makes something sustainable for people varies from person to person. If it isn't sustainable, then there's really no point in chasing a little bit of extra energy expenditure if you can't stick to it, right? So, and some people, but anyway,
No, I
Go ahead.
or do you have something
No,
else?
go ahead.
No, I agree with that, because if someone doesn't like meat, then this discussion's pointless. It's like, I'm not going to go on this type of diet. But I think there are a lot of real world benefits to this. Well, we have to assume that someone is equally going to stick to something, just for like a thought experiment. If they have no problems eating a high protein diet or paleo/keto type of thing, and they're not a vegan, they don't really care what they eat. If one works better than the other, and I think there are some benefits to being fat adapted, then what's going on?
I think a lot of the benefits to being fat adapted may be a little bit non-intuitive. A lot of the satiety stuff, especially. Yes, there's some information on ketones and satiety, but think about it from this perspective. You're usually not eating a lot of real fancy foods on keto, right? Like, it's not a lot of, I mean, you're obviously not having any sugar.
You mean like hyper palatable?
Right. Yeah, so they're not super palatable. I mean, butter by itself really isn't that palatable. You know what I mean? Like, people say, well, put a stick of butter in your coffee. It's awesome. Well, it's not that palatable, So, very few people are binge eating on butter. And by the same token, very few people are binge eating on a white potato. But if you put them together, people eat the shit out of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, like, if you take somebody, and so let's assume, again, equal adherence, right? Just for a thought experiment, because that was kind of what you mentioned.
Yeah.
If we just get people, whether it be high protein, high fat, low carb, but eating, basic whole food sources like that, or high protein, high carb, low fat, single ingredient foods, I think satiety is going to be pretty good on both. Like, it's going to be pretty difficult to overeat on both. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I think if you want to have, like, and this is where it comes in, if you want to have both carbs and fats, right? Like, you want a more balanced approach, then you've got to self-monitor in terms of tracking to some level, right? Because
but does that mean you're just hungrier all the time if you're trying to really just...
You have to remember that hunger is also a psychological thing, right? So for some people, even if they don't feel physically hungry, the feeling of being deprived of, they can't ever have cookies again, or they can't ever have, some of those people, it causes them to sporadically binge eat. So whereas, like, for me, again, this is why flexible dieting felt like a hack. If you just told me, hey, you can have 1 or 2 cookies and it's not going to completely blow your diet as long as you account for them, that was enough to satisfy me. I don't really get that physically hungry. So this is why, again, it's really individual, because I know that won't work for everybody. Some people get that physically hungry or psychologically hungry. But for me, it worked. And for a lot of people, it works. But for a lot of people, cutting out carbs or cutting out fats or whatever have you, or time restricted eating, those work, right? So that's why I tell people, I'm like, when people think I'm anti-keto, but I'm really not. I think everything is...
No, I know. You say if it works for you,
everything is tools in the tool belt, right? It's just trying to figure out what's going to work better for the average person, because that's the majority.
Okay, well then, keeping equal adherence, I still think that it would be better to choose the fat side, not keto. I don't do keto. I do nutrient density. And so, speak of anecdotes, what happened to me for years, I ate sort of a low carb diet, but I ate, say, only carbs at lunch. I'd have, like a breakfast sandwich with bread or like tortilla, all my only carbs, maintain weight. I was in shape for years. Totally great. Then I started studying this more, cut that out. And I replaced 2 pieces of bread or 2 tortillas a day to just sauteed onions. Basically, that's all I did. And I went through dramatic changes. I had problems with my wrists from overuse computer injuries. All that inflammation went away. I lost weight I didn't even know I had. I was like getting more ripped. Maybe you could say I was just eating at a deficit, but I was eating at maintenance for years on both sides of this change. You know what I mean? There wasn't some big...
What's that? Maintenance if you lost. So if you change foods from like bread to onion, onion is way less calorically dense. So you probably did cut calories, even if it didn't feel like it, because you probably felt more satiated just because they're filling.
Yeah. Well, I had to. You're correct. Yeah. I had to have been eating less calories because I got more ripped.
So, but and as far as the inflammation goes, that's possible. How much weight did you lose? Can I ask?
Not much. I don't think I lost any weight. I maybe I just replaced it with some muscle.
So you had a recomposition then. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you lost body fat though, for sure.
Yes.
And then did you change your training or anything, or did that basically stay the same?
No, it stayed the same for say 4 months, 5 months, and actually didn't gain muscle in those 4 months. It stayed the same. And then because my injuries went away, Then I started finally lifting again. And since then, I've gained muscle.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a couple things to unpack there. And this is the problem with N of 1 data is we don't know how much is physiological, psychological, and placebo, which doesn't discount what happened by any stretch of the imagination because it worked for you, period.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt about it. But if we're trying to look for a physiological reason why, most of the benefits on inflammation simply come from losing body fat because adipose tissue secretes adipokines, which are pro-inflammatory. So by losing that body fat, you probably reduce your overall levels of inflammation. Like, for example, here's my N of 1, just to give a juxtaposition, right? So I'm pretty lean, and I did an experiment where I ate at least 100 grams of sugar per day. My overall carbohydrate intake was about 350 to 400 grams a day. Now, if you talk to people who believe that sugar is the devil for inflammation and that sort of thing, I should have been inflamed beyond all belief. Now, they measured my levels of CRP and they were almost undetectable. My inflammation was so low. Now, again, it's an N of 1, right? But I think that speaks to the fact that was it that sugar is good for inflammation? No, I don't think we can say that. But it was the fact that I was very lean is why my levels of inflammation were low. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I was very lean. This entire time, I'm like almost 5'11", like 143. I was like 145, say, at the time. And I have very little body fat ever. So I don't think the inflammation was because of that. I play sports and I do my whole life. But still, we shouldn't even talk about my N of 1 thing. I just think that even look at the very top levels, that running on fat, just from an evolutionary perspective, seems like it's better to me or more what.
My pushback against that would be if running on fat was better, why, if you give carbohydrates and fat, will the body preferentially burn carbohydrate?
It's the faster burning fuel. I mean, if you give the brain ketones and glucose, it uses ketones preferably.
What are you basing that one off of?
That's a study. I think I brought this up.
Was that using exogenous ketones?
Yeah, it must have been, because to have them both at the same time.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen that. So if you'd want to send it to me, I would look at it.
I could send it. But just because glucose is burned preferentially in the short term, that doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, if you could just look at how much glucose the body can store in your muscles and your liver, you can store, say, like 600 grams of glucose, but you can store almost unlimited body fat. It's like the body fat seems like the preferred fuel if you look at it from that perspective. Seems like humans are kind of meant to run like batteries, where you store all this body fat and use it when you need it, right? And not rely on the glucose that may not always be around.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not sure how relevant it is. I think that, in terms of, I'm just not quite sure how to unpack this statement.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how relevant it is, regardless of, some people say that they just feel better fat adapted, and that's fine. It could be a physiological thing. It could be placebo. I feel great running on carbs and fats. People bring up metabolic flexibility, but the best way to be metabolically flexible is actually to use both.
Well, that's what metabolic. I think that's my definition of metabolic flexibility, is being able to burn fat and ketones. If you're just let
me challenge that for you. If you're metabolically flexible, you should be able to burn both. But if you are keto adapted and you challenge somebody with an oral glucose tolerance test, they will not clear glucose very well.
That's a different story. And also,
so this is why this is why I find the kind of argument about what the brain prefers and what the body prefers and all this kind of stuff, you're never going to know, because you can't go interview evolution. You know what I mean? You're never going to, it depends on your definition of prefers. If your definition of prefers is if you give both, which one does the body burn first, then it's glucose. If you make another definition, then the body will prefer that. So I think depending on your bias, you can skew it to, whatever you want to present the data as. So I don't it doesn't really bother me which way people say that it prefers one way or the other. Cause like I said, you can't really go ask evolution or ask God or, however you want to.
Well, have you ever been really fat adapted? Because I didn't care about this stuff or believe in it until I tried it. And then also you could say that's my bias because I tried it and it worked. But sure. I stepped back from my bias and looked at both sides. I watch vegan videos. I do everything. And And then I recalibrated sort of towards the middle, but then now I'm back on, both sides can work, but I believe that fat adaptation is preferable. And I didn't really find that until I really did it myself and experienced it. So have you really experienced that?
Yeah, so I did a ketogenic diet for about 8 weeks, and let me think about this. So I would say that I didn't really see a big difference. In fact, I didn't really get the keto flu that bad. Now, it might have been because I kind of ate at maintenance. So I purposely ate at maintenance. And the symptoms weren't that bad. I was a little sluggish for a few days. And then I would say after about 3 to 4 weeks, I felt fine. I would say that I didn't enjoy it as much in terms of my regular diet. But I didn't really see big performance boosts, and I didn't really see big performance drops. It kind of stayed the same, which is what I kind of would expect if you look at, like my sport, which is powerlifting. You're only doing, if I was doing like 8 to 15 reps of, something pretty anaerobic and glycogen depleting, then I would have probably expected to maybe see some performance decrements because you can't use ketones for anaerobic performance. But when you're just using kind of your creatine phosphate system, which is what powerlifting uses, it was fine. I just didn't enjoy it as much, so I went back. But I didn't really see. Now, if you're endurance, some endurance people report that they really prefer it. I don't know, but then you've got like Zach Bitter, who's I believe an ultra endurance person. He follows me on Twitter, and we've had some talks. He still carb loads before a race, I believe, based on our interaction and what he said. So,
he uses like some targeted carbs, I think, or like during the race. I mean, he does have some, maybe a bit of glucose, but
right. So
I think maybe he tops off.
The pushback would be though, if fats are so great and being fatted out is the greatest thing, because all it takes is having glucose to kick you out of that. So why would you just run on fat?
No, he does. These people do mostly run on fat, but I think at a certain point, if you need to do a push or you're, at the end, it is good to have those glycogen stores still available. So they just use targeted glucose to get that glycogen for, say, like a big push. But mainly they're running on fat.
It probably seems like I'm trying to be argumentative, and I'm not. I'm just kind of trying to challenge some of your statements and make you defend your points. So
that's fine.
It's
I'd say maybe some
like when we go into kind of I don't ever like to assume the body's motivation. You know what I mean? So it's I think these are interesting questions, but I'm not really sure how to answer them.
Well, for you specifically, maybe part of the advantage when people go keto is that they're at that deficit. And if you maintained your calories, then maybe you didn't see all the benefits. And I'm not saying that there's something like super magical about keto. I think there's therapeutic benefits. I think there's some appetite suppressing qualities that's good for, maybe people with epilepsy and Alzheimer's, stuff like that. But maybe you didn't see all the results because you purposely ate to a calorie.
Maybe, but here's my major problem with keto, people who are very pro keto is no matter what you do, they'll say if you did the other thing, that it would have been better. So we just got done talking about a study that increased energy expenditure when people were at maintenance, even though we don't see that in a deficit. And everybody's making a big deal. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like trying to play both sides of the court.
Kind of, but I mean, I'm also not a keto guy. I'd rather,
You just said you were though. I'm just challenging.
No. Well, I'm just saying that there are benefits. Or okay, I don't even know what we're even talking about. Well, we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole. I would never say that there aren't benefits to being in a ketogenic state, of course. But there's also everything, for every gimme, there's a gotcha, right? And you've just got to decide for you as an individual what makes the most sense. Okay, what about people like long term? I don't know if it's even possible to prove this, but I think people do fine for 30 years, 40 years on, say, maybe a more high carb diet. But then just there seems to be so much research that I don't know if you agree with or not that shows that eventually it catches up to them. There's these people like Tim Noakes.
Is it so? I mean, look, you mentioned the Okinawans. They have like some of the longest life expectancy in the world.
Yeah, but they're eating a deficit. They're not eating a bunch of processed sugar. They're not eating. Okay, in American society, the people who I just brought up Professor Tim Noakes. He's an athlete running marathons, very lean, and then got type 2 diabetes. These things catch up with you later and you don't realize it. And you're on the outside, you're thin. So this may be theoretical. It's too hard to test on these like 40, 50 years, like over the course of a lifetime. But why in America do we have so many problems? Everyone is just eating more, just spontaneously in 1980, everyone decided to just eat more, and it has nothing to do with, say, the carbohydrate composition.
Well, I think it does have something to do with the carbohydrate composition. But if you look at like the last 10 years, sugar intake has gone down. Actually, like 15 years. Sugar intake and whole grain intake has gone down. So the one thing that has been very consistent that has gone up with the obesity crisis, I just made a post about this on Instagram actually just today, calorie intake has gone up almost linearly with obesity. So it's a correlation of R of 0.93, which is really tight for physiological stuff, like very tight.
Yeah, I believe the calorie intake has gone up, yes.
So yes, it is part carbohydrate, but it's also part fat, and it's also part everything, right? And you cannot discount the lack of energy expenditure, like reduction in exercise, because exercise sensitizes you to satiety signals. So it's, again, one of those things that it is it's like, people want to come up with one cause for cancer or one solution for cancer. And the fact of the matter is that cancer is like a hydra. You chop one head off and two more grow back in its place. Obesity is a very multifactorial disease. And I will say, as far as Tim Noakes goes, it's always hard for me because I don't want to sound like I'm saying he's lying or anything like that. But I would really like to see his blood work and like verify that, because it does happen where people develop type 2 diabetes and they're not overweight and vice versa, but it's pretty rare.
Is it?
It's pretty rare.
I thought a lot of people thin on the outside, fat on the inside. There's fatty liver disease. I thought it was not that rare for thinner people. And it kind of goes along with your view of things, the adipose-centric. Well, okay, there's two, like there's the carbohydrate.
Somebody who is physically active, that is extremely rare if they would be type 2 diabetic. Extremely rare. I am very confident in saying that.
Really?
Absolutely.
I've just heard more about it. I thought this was more common than.
I would say it's very, very uncommon. Very uncommon. But it does happen. It does happen. There are people who are not fat who develop type 2 diabetes, and there are people who are fat who do not have type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, it goes both ways. That's why there's different theories of it.
But it's usually very closely associated. I mean, I think that I think that both things have a similar causes, and they develop in parallel in most cases. But sure, I mean, are there outliers where one could develop without the other? Absolutely. I don't doubt that.
Well, I don't think it's that uncommon. I'm just thinking of more cases of this. And
I'd love to see the data prove me wrong.
Yeah. Also, do you think sugar has addictive quality? Do you think people can be addicted to carbs and sugar? I
guess it depends on how you define as addictive.
Well, do you think they're more easier to overeat than? Okay, I think part of the benefit is that if you're being fat adapted, I think many people say they are less interested in carbs and sugar, and I've found that as well. I feel like it's better. It's like these side benefits is that you change your eating habits to not focus around those things, and then you have the benefits of not overeating on carbs and sugar, which are everywhere in our food society, and they're the cheapest. I think there's many things that line up to say that fat is better.
Tell me, make your question a little bit more succinct. Like,
do you think there's a benefit of being fat adapted is to not be, quote, addicted to hyperpalatable, like sugars and carbohydrates?
So I just posted a study where they provided free access to refined or unrefined carbohydrate, or diets high in unrefined carbohydrate, or free access to diets high in refined fat, and found that they didn't overeat until they were given access to diets high in refined fat. So now you could say, well, it's refined fat, it's not, natural fat, whatever. I think, again, that hyperpalatable foods tend to be high in both, that they're sugar and fat. I don't know if carbohydrates are addictive. I mean, people say, well, they trip the same sensor in your brain as cocaine or whatever. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that trips that. Anything that's pleasurable is going to trip your dopamine sensor. So you could say, well, you like to have sex, so you must be addicted to sex. No. Do I like to eat do I find it pleasurable to eat a bag of Reese's Pieces? Sure. But am I addicted to it? If you told me I could never have it again, I mean, I probably would be a little bit disappointed, but I wouldn't run out and knock over a 7-Eleven. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it just depends on the definition of addictive. Do some people really have trouble moderating their intake of those hyperpalatable foods? Yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether you would call that addictive or not. And like I said, people tend to overeat on foods that are high in carbs, sugars, and fat, not just sugar.
Yeah. No, I believe
in the case of sugar sweetened beverages seem to be maybe a little bit different.
Well, and also those provide no satiety too. But yeah.
Correct.
So,
correct.
Okay, well, about nutrient density. So I think this angle is maybe the most important. I think the evolutionary angle that we should run on fat is good, but also nutrient density, I think that's important, right? And the nutrient dense foods are these foods that are more protein and fat oriented. And then the least nutrient dense foods are carb and fat oriented, or just carb. So
how are you defining, so I'm going to challenge you again. How are you defining nutrient dense?
Well, I don't like Joel Fuhrman's way of doing it just by calorie. If you do it just per calorie, and I think he even penalizes for saturated fat. So his version has kale and spinach at the top, which is great. Those are very nutrient dense, but he has animal foods way down at the bottom. But my version of nutrient density is the amount of bioavailable nutrients. Well, that's a different discussion too, whether or not they're bioavailable. But yeah, the micronutrients.
So you mean like heme iron or something like that?
No, we'll just bioavailable. We'll just say like the difference between vitamin A.
Okay, it's good.
Okay,
go ahead.
In a plant food compared to, or like vitamin K1 in plants are not as bioavailable as vitamin K2 in meat, or that you're not absorbing them all, or fat soluble vitamins if you're getting them with fat.
Okay. So you're defining it as quality and digestibility of the vitamins and minerals associated in those foods.
Yeah. And then maybe you'd even throw in protein. I don't know if that's getting too many things going on, but we both agree on how essential protein is. These are the building blocks of life, is protein and micronutrients. Fat and carbs could be thought of more as fuel sources, although fat...
Micronutrients are really just cofactors and enzymes. But I mean, you need them. Otherwise, obviously, you can have problems.
Well, actually, maybe stop for a second. Do you think that the micronutrient don't matter that much? Like, say, populations that eat
I think it matters, absolutely. For obesity, I think energy intake matters much, much more.
Yeah. Okay.
There is some evidence that things like vitamin D, if you're low in vitamin D, that it can lower your energy expenditure and those sorts of things. But
aside from obesity, just in like healthy populations, ones that eat very nutrient-dense foods compared to someone eating just like a white potato and like some chicken breast.
So so the importance for preventing obesity or for just overall
health, not obesity, nothing at all about obesity.
The problem, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just telling you that the problem is trying to define health, because that's kind of a nebulous term. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like if you're defining it by like heart rate, blood pressure, blood lipids, blood glucose, our biomarkers we have, and then making sure that you're not deficient in micronutrients and that you don't have elevated liver enzymes or kidney, that's kind of stuff. I'm not sure, but I guess my pushback to that would be, if that is so important, you could just take a multivitamin that's high in bioavailability of the different sources, and you could just eat kind of whatever you wanted as long as you hit your calories. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just challenging your. Well, I'm kind of challenging I think that all those things are important. Okay, let me be clear. I think that all that stuff is important. I think that the point is that if you reduce your intake, people make a big deal about, like, for example, food processing. People make a big deal about the food processing. It's not that food processing has like some magical characteristic that makes you just suddenly get fat. Yeah. It's that processed foods taste really good and they're low satiety value.
Yeah, and they dilute the protein. They're usually low in protein and low in nutrients. Yeah, and it's almost like
right. So that's there is like a Ted Naiman, actually. I'm sure you know him.
Oh, of course, he's great.
Put this up on Twitter. We generally agree on a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I think he sometimes misses a little bit of the forest through the trees, but generally very good. He put that up, the kind of the protein stat theory, that because these foods are devoid of protein, that we're getting a bunch of calories without enough protein, and that's why we're getting fat, because your body has these kind of protein stats.
Protein leverage hypothesis. Yes.
Right. But that has been kind of roundly disproven, to be honest, because protein, if it was, now, again, I'm a protein guy. Yeah. Okay. So everybody remember this. Like, my bias is protein. When I went to grad school, I wanted to find more reasons to eat more protein more frequently. Okay. So protein intake did not drop when the obesity crisis began. It actually kind of went up a little bit. And if you've got other hang on, so you got other societies that consume low protein and are lower obesity rate, and you've got Americans and Western societies actually eat more protein than most and are fatter. That being said, I think there probably is something to protein leverage, but I don't think it's the primary driver of obesity. I think it's a part of it. I think that if you're eating higher protein relative to carbohydrate and fat, that's more satiating, higher level of thermogenesis. And so it's helpful. But I think marking that as kind of the primary driver of obesity, I think has probably been pretty debunked.
I wouldn't say it's a primary driver at all. And I don't know if he's saying it either. I think it's just a factor. Well, if you just think about eating a meal with, say, 100 grams of protein and then, 50 grams of whatever, vegetables, and then you gave someone a processed one of 100 grams of protein and 50 grams of vegetables and 50 extra grams of carbs. That's like the dilution. It's like I would still eat that full meal with those excess carbs. And I could have been just as full without those extra carbs, I guess is one way to think of it. Diluting the protein out, you're getting extra carbs.
Sure, but that boils down to a behavior modification of just understanding your satiety signals and responding to them. Because like you said, you were already full. So why would you actually have that extra thing unless you had bought it, put it in your house, and decided you're going to eat it anyway? Right.
That's why I'm saying it's definitely not the biggest factor, because yes, you can be full with eating low protein. It's just you're talking about body composition. What's better? So I guess maybe it's more of
I think
better to have
body composition. Yeah. So like again, I'm not sitting on any side of the fence. I think that in general, higher protein diets are probably better. For body composition and weight loss. I think that the data is pretty. Pardon me. Damn cold's kicking my butt. I think that all the keto people will be like, see, that's because you had sugar the last few weeks.
I would say it's because you don't have enough nutrients. Well, ever since I did a nutrient dense diet, I haven't been sick in 4 years.
I would say it's because I have toddlers.
All right.
So overall, I think some things emerge. Higher protein diets do emerge in the weight loss research as being a little bit better and better for weight maintenance. I just try not to get too dogmatic about anything that I'm talking about, because I think it becomes dangerous if you do. Yeah. And I think that, and everybody's going to be biased towards what worked for them, of course. Like I'm biased towards a more flexible diet because it worked for me. But I also understand that it's inappropriate. Not everybody you can tell, hey, you can have a bag of Reese's Pieces and still be in a calorie deficit. That's fine.
To weeks of madness to some people.
Right. So some people have to omit foods. My girlfriend Holly, we have the candy in our house is in a lockbox because she does not have an off switch. It's more for snacking. Like she has trouble not snacking. Mm-hmm. So all the kind of snackable things are in a lockbox, right? You could set all those things out on my counter and I wouldn't touch them if I didn't want to. So it just, again, it's very individually dependent. I think that that's where hopefully where nutrition research is going to go in the future is trying to figure out, hopefully getting a better predictor. Maybe there's physiological markers, psychological markers we can figure out to understand, hey, maybe this person does better on this type of strategy than this. So we don't fumble around for a few years trying to figure out what works while people get fatter. But I think we're going to get some of that data, but I think that there's probably not a whole lot of researchers that are thinking that way just yet.
Maybe not. But also you say it's dangerous to get too dogmatic on one thing. I think it might be a little dangerous to just say nothing matters, just do the energy balance thing. I think that's dangerous. I even found myself sliding into that in a couple weeks because I'm just like, nothing matters. And you just slide into eating whatever you want because at least I'll just be disciplined and be at a deficit. But I think that's bad long-term is the nutrient density matters over time.
Yeah, I would say getting into mentality, hopefully I've not come across this saying nothing matters. I just think that some things matter more than other things, right? So
adherence, eating a deficit and adherence,
caloric deficit, but that doesn't mean that any of those other factors like food processing or caloric density or protein stat or satiety, it doesn't mean they don't matter. It just means that they matter less than the major things, right? So that's why I try to get people not to major in the minors, because a lot of people get so caught up in for time restricted eating and it improved insulin sensitivity by 20% and this and that. It's like, okay, well, great, but you can't even stick to that for 3 days, so it doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
if somebody can stick to it, then great, then maybe there's an extra benefit to it. So that's kind of where I look at it.
All right. Well, we're kind of wrapping up here. Well, okay. Last thing is, what if you're looking at? I feel like you're looking at this from this weightlifting. You're coaching, and you are a bigger guy. And you can get away with eating more calories from and you can be more disciplined. All that you and these people are very good about tracking and all this stuff. It seems like it's all under this light of bodybuilding that other people.
Well, that's my background.
Why? Yeah.
Sure.
But other people, normal people, they can't really get away with eating as much energy in general, whatever it may be, or they're not good at tracking or they're not as disciplined. So I think it's.
Absolutely. And that's why it's not appropriate for everybody. Right. So for some people, it's going to be much more appropriate to say, hey, you're going to need to limit your intake of, sugar, and you're going to need to limit your intake of refined fats and that sort of thing. And you need to stick to whole foods and whatnot, because for not everybody is going to find tracking to be as easy as me. Mm-hmm. And not everybody is going to have, for example, flexible dieting. Like for me to eat, for example, 2 Pop-Tarts, 80 grams of carbohydrate, of mostly sugar, that is a pretty small percentage of my overall daily caloric intake. Mm-hmm. So I can still get all my micronutrients, all my macro targets, all that kind of stuff. And I can still be fine.
Yeah.
But if somebody has a slow metabolism, they're inactive. They're only eating about 100 grams of carbs a day, like 45 grams of fat, 50 grams of fat, and 140 grams of protein or something like that. Well, it's pretty dumb to get 80% of your total carbohydrate intake from 2 Pop-Tarts that aren't very filling.
Exactly.
Right?
It's expensive. So if you think about it that way, it's expensive.
Yes. You're basically buying a sports car on a $30,000 budget.
Yeah.
And that's actually what I use a lot when describing flexible dieting. It's like a budget, right? So if you are somebody who lifts weights, you have more lean body mass, you have a fast metabolism, you have a big budget. You're a macro millionaire. You can eat kind of what you like for the most part, because also, like, if you're eating more calories, you're just getting more vitamins and minerals through mass effect, right? Mm-hmm. So, but if you're somebody who's trying to lose weight and you're down to pretty low calories, you must choose nutrient-dense foods or vitamin and mineral-dense foods. Otherwise, you're not going to hit those requirements because you're just eating less food.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so context dependent. And you make a good point that I lift weights, I eat more overall food, and I can get away with some of this stuff, whereas the average person can't. And that's 100% correct.
Yeah. Well, okay. So my general wrap up is that I've taken a look at both sides. I'm very on board with most everything you say, but I just saw more indications that we should be heading down this fat route, if that works for you. So I don't know if you're prepared to say that, because you're just like, I'm just in the middle. I'm not going to say anything. But if you look at the evolutionary argument.
No, I think for some people, we don't know enough about evolution yet, but I think for some people, they probably do better on a lower carb, higher fat diet. And I think for some people, it's the opposite. And I think what we need to try and start to tease apart in the future is, what are the sociological, psychological, and physiological reasons that some people do better on one versus the other? And once we start getting those questions answered, then we're really going to be able to dive deeper into those subgroups and figure out why those things are happening.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the future is figuring out this personalization. And is there genetic factors? It could even be your ancestors, depending on your geography. Some people did eat more high carb diets. And, if you're more north, you're eating more meat. So I guess that has something to do with it.
Correct.
I just think with the nutrient density angle, there's just a few angles. I guess my main point is I agree it's what you stick to, but I just feel like there's more indicators of nutrient density stuff that's hard to argue. It's hard to argue with nutrient density. Aside from big bodybuilder guys, the normal person, is 160 pounds? I don't know. Now that's probably more because everyone's getting fat, but they don't have the leeway to eat a bunch of trash and be okay. So it just seems that
Agreed. Yeah. I think we're probably closer than a lot of people think listening.
Yeah. Well, no, we are.
I really try to define my terms. So I challenge people when they say things like nutrient density to define what they're talking about. When they use words like efficiency, define what you're saying, because those have different meanings to different people. So when I do that, I'm just trying to define it for the audience so they can understand a little bit better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So in closing, what is the biggest thing you've changed your mind about? It's not like you say that you're perfect and you never change your mind over the years, just to let people know that.
Oh, I definitely changed my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Probably, I think the coolest thing that ever happened was my PhD research actually made me change the way I ate, which I think is pretty cool. So, because at the end of the day, like you said, I'm a bodybuilder. I want to do what's best for body composition. I wanted to find more reasons to eat more protein more frequently. And so when I went into grad school, I was eating probably 300 grams of protein a day and eating 8 meals a day. When I came out of grad school, I was eating about 250 grams of protein and about 4 to 5 meals a day. Mm-hmm. So I guess that was I found that the cap, or not the cap, but the benefits of protein capped out lower than what I would have liked them, right? Because I really wanted the magic cure to be just eat a crap load of protein because I thought protein was cool. Well, it turns out that it doesn't really work that way. And, it turns out that, eating 8 meals a day probably wasn't the best thing either. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, the coolest thing I changed my mind on, just because I got some research data back that really contradicted what I thought it would say. And it made me really I had to ask myself, am I just going to go continue to eat this way because I have beliefs, or am I going to actually trust what the research says and what my own research says? Because otherwise, what the hell was the point of me of doing this research?
Yeah, wait, what is it? People say, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight or something.
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, but it looks like the benefits of protein really top out at around 2.8 grams per kilogram of lean body mass, which for most people is probably just above 1 gram per pound.
Yeah, and then it's diminishing returns.
Very diminishing returns, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's good to know. I just think people are so scared of protein, especially even keto people. They're like, I'm going to get knocked out of ketosis if I eat too much protein.
Yeah, you can. But
yeah, no, you can. But
most people have trouble eating that much protein.
Exactly. And then I also say, why are you so worried about being in ketosis 24/7 anyway? I mean, I'm accidentally in ketosis probably, but I'm just eating protein and vegetables and whatnot, and I'm doing great. Awesome. Well, I think this was great. What can we leave people with? Your book's coming out soon?
Yeah, so that should be out in around 4 weeks from today. So probably early to mid-December. The Fat Loss Forever, my new book will be out, or ebook will be out. And I already have a contest preparation guide that's available that's 300 plus pages. There's nothing like it for people who are more body composition focused, maximize retention of lean body mass and lose maximum body fat. That's a really useful guide. We've got a lot of great reviews about that. And then my girlfriend, Holly, she has a recipe guide it's pretty great, lower calorie recipes that are very satiating but also very tasty. So we offer all those on the BioLayne store. And then, if you want to keep up with me on social media, my handle is BioLayne on pretty much everything. And come debate with me in the comments.
Yeah, that'll be
scrap.
I've seen some stuff ever since I started looking you up recently. It's funny to see these crazy people out there, and you have some good wars.
Yeah, I enjoy a good mental scrap, but I get really triggered by stupidity. So I have a hard time keeping it friendly sometimes, which is probably a downfall to me.
Yeah, well, that happens. I try to stay friendly with vegans, who I mostly debate with. But yeah, I think it's good to we need Sean Bakers in the world to combat vegans, I guess. So I guess you're doing well at combating anyone who gets too wrapped up in their way of doing things. So
yeah, and then you need me to combat the Sean Bakers.
I saw that too. I don't know. That's probably a different discussion, but
yeah, definitely. It looks like I'm going to be in a debate on a podcast with him. So that I never thought I'd find myself defending plants. My God.
Oh, really?
That shows how far the extremism has gone. Yeah, I think I'm probably going to be on Mark Bell's podcast with Sean Baker. We're trying to iron out the details.
Well, I'll be listening.
Cool.
All right, man. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian. Nice talking to you.
There it is, folks. Come yell at me on Twitter or Instagram about the things I should have challenged him on. Just search for Food Lies. Leave us a review on your podcast app or iTunes. I know it's a chore, but it really helps. Pre-order the Food Lies film on Indiegogo. Click through the link here in the show notes or go to foodlies.org. Spread the word and share it with a friend or family member, and we'll be back next week for a really great episode with a homestead farmer living off the land, eating the most nutrient-dense food possible, and refuting vegan propaganda.